Hey everybody, so today we have chapter 15, which is Reconstruction. So where we left off before Christmas break, we had fought the Civil War, the North had won, Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Shortly after the war, Lincoln is assassinated. So now we have the issue of what to do next. How do we put the country back together? And that is what Reconstruction is all about. So the big question here, and if you were to see this topic on the AP exam, it would probably be something about the extent to which the Constitution is going to change and society is going to change, social developments, how that contributed to maintaining continuity and fostering change during the Civil War up to the end of Reconstruction. So that's what we're going to get to with chapter 15. So where we left off, after the Civil War, 500,000 Americans are dead, by far the largest death rate of any American war. The South is totally destroyed. It is rubble. The railroads have been pulled up. Think about Sherman's March to the Sea, where they just walked through the South, destroying everything. Cotton production, which had been the basis of their whole economy, is virtually non-existent. So now all of these questions, and AMSCO laid this out really well, all of these challenges, these questions about what to do. So how are we going to rebuild the South, their economy? Their whole society has changed now that slavery has been ended. So how do we fix that? What do we do with these 4 million newly freed former slaves who are now a part of society? Should the federal government help them? How much should they help them? That's going to be a big debate. How should we treat the former Confederate states? How should the former leaders of the Confederacy be treated? Should they be allowed to vote or hold seats in Congress? How would they be brought back into the Union? If we're going to be put back together as the United States, how do we bring them back in? And the biggest one, possibly, who gets to decide the answer to these questions? Is it the president or is it Congress? And that's where the bulk of the disagreements are going to come when it comes to Reconstruction policy. So before Lincoln is assassinated, he lays out his plan for how he would accomplish this. And we call it the 10% plan. All you need to know about this one is that it is simple, it is lenient. His goal was to get the Confederate States back into the Union as quickly and painlessly as possible. His view was they never even actually left, that secession wasn't even really a thing. They were just in rebellion, so it shouldn't be that difficult for them to come back in. So his plan, if 10% of the voters in that state took an oath of loyalty, they would be able to reapply for statehood, for entrance into the Union. Congress, mainly what we're going to call the radical Republicans in Congress, think his plan is too easy on the South. Like they just caused this whole war and we're just going to let them come back in like nothing ever happened. No, they come up with the Wade-Davis bill, which these are just the last names of the two men who are proposing it, where they say we need 50%, at least half of the voters in that state, to say that they're loyal to the Union. They make more strict rules on emancipation of slaves to ensure that that is going to happen. Their goal is more to punish the former Confederate states, make it difficult for them to come back in, whereas Lincoln just wanted it to happen as quickly as possible. So a big difference. Oh, and if you're wondering, if you're a baseball fan, you might know, but this guy's name is Wade Davis. So he used to play for the Royals. That's why he's on there, Wade-Davis bill. The Wade-Davis bill is pocket vetoed, which just means that it basically expires on Lincoln's desk. So instead of signing it, he just lets it sit there and Congress adjourns. So it goes away. He doesn't technically say no to it, but because he leaves it sitting there, it doesn't take effect. One good thing that comes out of Reconstruction, so a lot of the stuff we'll talk about for the former slaves in the South are bad things that come, but this one is a good one. So the Freedmen's Bureau is created by Congress. The main goal was to just provide welfare services for the freedmen that don't have anywhere to live, don't have any money, don't have any food. So provide those basic necessities. Over time, it's going to evolve to be more focused around education. So when you hear about the Freedmen's Bureau, it's usually the schools that you hear about, that it sends teachers from the North into the South to educate these former slaves. There would be small children all the way up to elderly people in the same room learning to read together because most of them have not been afforded that opportunity when they were enslaved. So this is a good thing. for former slaves in the South, the Freedmen's Bureau. After Lincoln is assassinated, Andrew Johnson, who is his vice president, becomes president. He looks exactly like Tommy Lee Jones, which is kind of freaky. So there you go. There's the comparison. This is Johnson. That's Tommy Lee Jones. He is chosen back in 1864 as Lincoln's running mate, basically to bring in a wing of the Republican Party, bring in votes from someone who is very different from Lincoln. So he's a Southerner. He is a Southern Republican from Tennessee. Really, he's more, his politics often look more Democratic than Republican, but he's not the right person for this job. For one thing, he is a white supremacist, and many of his vetoes that he makes over things that the Republicans from Congress bring to his desk prove that. And he is absolutely hated by the radical Republicans in Congress who are trying to accomplish Reconstruction and ensure that the rights of these newly freed slaves are being upheld. So we know there's going to be major clashes between Andrew Johnson and the radicals in Congress. They try to impeach him, but it's not successful. It almost is. So this guy's going to have a really tough time in office. So there's a lot here. I'll hit high points. Basically, he is more towards Lincoln's plan than that Wade Davis bill. So we'll call it the 10% plus plan. Like he's just adding a little bit onto that. So Lincoln's plan, but also disfranchisement, which just means that these people don't get the right to vote anymore. So if you were a leader in the Confederacy or held office like Jefferson Davis, you don't get to vote anymore. You're no longer considered an eligible voter in the United States. Or if you had more than $20,000 in taxable property, you were not allowed to vote, unless Andrew Johnson personally pardoned you and gave you the ability to do that, which he's going to do that quite often, actually. Results of this, of Johnson's tactics, it's fast. It makes it to where all 11 states who had seceded are back into the Union within 8 months. Because he is personally pardoning some of these Confederate office holders, it allows them to return to power, which is what the radical Republicans were trying to prevent, is these people from returning to power in the South. And there becomes a face-off between Johnson and these radicals in Congress. Johnson continues to veto everything that they try to pass. He uses the veto 29 times, which up until that point was by far the most of any president. Grant is going to beat him on that. But at this point, that is a lot of vetoes. Once they have a majority, the radicals have a majority in Congress, they are able to override Johnson's veto on a lot of these. And that's when they try to get rid of them, but it fails. So bad things. We said the Freedmen's Bureau was a good thing for freedmen, former slaves in the South. Black codes are not good. This is bad. This is how they're attempting, whites in the South are attempting to regulate the affairs of free blacks in the South, to continue to control them in the effort to have a subservient labor force. Even though slavery has technically ended, it looks a whole lot like slavery still. So some of these are like state level laws that the Southern states were passing. So they couldn't serve on juries, you can't rent land, you can't borrow money to buy land. Some states had curfews for free blacks, forced labor contracts. So it's basically slavery. And there's no way for the freed slaves to advance in society if you can't own land, you can't make money. And what ends up happening is they end up in this cycle of sharecropping where you're basically a slave pretty much, that you have to give a certain percentage, usually half, to a landowner in exchange for you being able to farm that land. It's this cycle of poverty that by 1880, less than 5% of Southern blacks own land. So 15 years after the Civil War, less than 5% even own their own land. If that shows you how stifling these black codes were for former slaves in the South. So Civil War amendments, in this chapter, it talked about 3. We call them the Civil War amendments, 13, 14, 15. The way you can remember these is free citizens vote. 13th frees the slaves, it abolishes slavery. 14 grants citizenship rights to former slaves. This is also the one that includes the due process clause, equal protection, Moving forward, a lot of the Supreme Court cases that we'll talk about, like in the 1900s, reference back to this 14th Amendment. So free citizens vote. 15 gives the right to vote for all men at this point. So even former slaves who were men were able to vote. Women aren't going to like this because a lot of women, a lot of the leaders of the women's rights movement were big supporters of ending slavery, and they feel like with the 15th Amendment, they've just been totally passed over. So we see a big split in the women's rights movement over this 15th Amendment as well. We enter a new phase. So we had like presidential Reconstruction, which was Lincoln and Johnson's plans put into action. Then we see a shift where the radicals in Congress are going to get enough of a majority to do whatever they want, regardless of what President Johnson wants to do. So we call this radical Reconstruction. You also hear it called military Reconstruction, where basically they put troops in the South and force the Southerners to do what they want them to do with the military. So there's a report that comes out called the Report of the Joint Committee, where Congress comes out and says, we have the authority to figure out how these states get to come back in, not you, President Johnson, and they're going to exercise what they believe is their role and that he has overstepped by allowing them to come back in. This is where they officially reject all of Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction plan. So all these states who thought they had gone through the process were now back in the Union. Congress says, oh, nope, we're in charge now. We're going to tell you how this is going to go, not President Andrew Johnson. During this phase of Reconstruction, there's an act that is passed that puts the South directly under military control. And if this sounds a lot like the Hunger Games, it is similar. So it makes districts. There are 5 districts. There is a Union general. There are troops with guns stationed in the South, basically overseeing Reconstruction and ensuring that they're following the rules, that these white supremacist Southern politicians don't regain control and just go back to the way things were before the Civil War. So this is the phase we call military Reconstruction. Congress, now that they have their majority, they're going to try to get rid of Andrew Johnson. Really what he's impeached for is this Tenure of Office Act, which was created by Congress, more like a trap to catch Andrew Johnson so that they could try to impeach him. So really, they don't have a good reason for this other than they don't like him and he keeps standing in the way of what they're trying to do. It ends up failing by 1 vote in the Senate, that there are some from the Republican Party that don't vote to remove him, just because they feel like that sets a bad precedent for, if we have political differences, we'll get rid of you. They don't want that to become the thing, which is a good thing that that hasn't been the case. So Johnson is the first president to ever be impeached. Since then, Bill Clinton and most recently Donald Trump have also been impeached as president. None of them have been removed from office, though, after their impeachment. All right, to finish up, so we have a new election. They don't re-elect Andrew Johnson. The Democrats nominate Horatio Seymour, and then the Republicans nominate Ulysses S. Grant, the war general from the Civil War. Grant has 0 political experience, and he's actually going to be a really bad president. If you ever get a question on the exam or anything about corruption and scandal and like the most corrupt president, he's in like the top 3. It's not that he's a bad guy. He just puts his buddies who have no business being there into political office. That spoils system that we saw like with Andrew Jackson. So the black vote is going to secure Grant's victory. So because of the 15th Amendment, former slaves are able to vote for the first time, and they overwhelmingly, obviously, vote for the Republican Party and not the Southern white Democrats. During this election, 600 African Americans are elected to state assemblies, which is groundbreaking. This is, again, due to the 15th Amendment being passed. It's ratified in 1870. The first black senator is a guy named Hiram Revels from Mississippi. This is like the national Senate. And so he is the first to be elected. And then by 1875, there are 8 who are elected to the House, the National House of Representatives, and many, many in state level legislatures as well. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 is passed. This is an attempt to prohibit discrimination. It is not really enforced all that well. And it is going to be overturned eventually by the Supreme Court. Parts of it are, but they're attempting to prohibit discrimination in public places and from keeping courts from excluding Blacks on juries. So they're trying in Congress to protect the freedmen in the South. It's just not going to go very far. This is where we get into scandal. So throughout the South, there are scandalous things. There's corruption, there's graft going on. Scalawags, there's nicknames. Scalawags is the nickname for Southern Republicans. So there's Southern whites who support the Republican Party, and white Democrats think they're traitors, basically. Carpetbaggers, this is depicting a carpetbagger. They're people from the North and the West that come to the South during Reconstruction for whatever reason, either to profit, somehow to start a business, just to get in on the money that is available through all of these Reconstruction efforts. If you get a question, you see this as well, about the success of Reconstruction. For the most part, in the end, it's going to fail because of the Compromise of 1877. The Republicans end up pulling troops out of the South, and in the next 100 years, so the Civil War ends in 1865. It's going to be until 1965 when we get Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. Not a whole lot is going to improve for Black people in the South in that 100 years. So if Reconstruction was successful, I don't think it would have taken 100 years for things to actually change in the South. So if you get a question asking you to evaluate the level of success of Reconstruction, it would be tough to argue that, yeah, it was very successful, because it just wasn't. Other reasons that there's going to be challenges in the South, I'm sure you've heard of the Ku Klux Klan. It begins in Tennessee, 1866. They use violence and intimidation tactics to try to keep Blacks from voting, from exercising their 15th Amendment right to vote. These force acts are passed by Congress in an attempt to limit things like the KKK. Again, not going to be that effective just because of the way the KKK operates, just as kind of in secret or hidden. Other ways that they limit voting, things like literacy tests, and we'll look at one of those a little later on at how ridiculous they were. Poll taxes, where you'd have to pay to go vote. And then finally, the grandfather clause, which said, if your grandfather was able to vote before this date, you can also vote. The date that they set is before the 15th Amendment, so no one who was in slavery themselves or whose ancestors were enslaved would qualify to vote under that. So it's like a way to get poor white people who can't read to be able to vote, but keep free Blacks from voting. So all of these are ways that they would limit them from exercising their right to vote. And finally, we get into, this is more time period 6, which is kind of a preview of it, what we call the Gilded Age. So it's this era after the Civil War where there is scandal and corruption, political, dirty things going on. So this gave a few examples. There's a gold scandal, the Tweed ring. So this is Boss Tweed. If you ever see a big guy in a political cartoon with a suit on or money bags, it's probably Boss Tweed, who made a whole lot of money off of his political machine called Tammany Hall through bribes and corruption and stealing money, lying to taxpayers. He's going to end up being caught mainly because of the guy who drew these cartoons. His name's Thomas Nast. But if you see anything, he's a good example of that Gilded Age corruption and scandal. Grant administration, like I mentioned, extremely corrupt. He puts his buddies into these positions, high-ranking cabinet positions that they have no experience for, and they steal a bunch of money. An example of that is the whiskey ring, where his brother-in-law was a part of it. Next one is credit mobilier scandal. This one involves a railroad. Basically, they're hiring themselves at inflated prices to do construction for this railroad company. Whiskey ring was part of the Grant administration. People in his cabinet were a part of this, where they're just stealing tax money. So there's a whiskey tax and they're taking money and stealing it off of that. So I like this cartoon. Here's Grant holding up corruption, and this is supposed to be the whiskey ring, all the people involved who were pocketing money that they weren't supposed to be. So you see, the Gilded Age has the best political cartoons. This Puck magazine, they've got some really good ones. Judge is another one that you'll see. So we'll look at a lot of cartoons for that. So the end of Reconstruction is going to come with an election. So in 1876, we have Rutherford B. Hayes. Oh yes, and there is what he looked like when he was young. Much different than when he's elected. Democrats run Samuel Tilden, who also had a role in catching Boss Tweed. So that's kind of where he got his fame. There's a dispute in the returns. Tilden is one electoral college vote short, and there are 3 states where the returns are disputed, like they don't really know who won. So we make a deal. What ends up happening, this is important, that's why it's red. The Compromise of 1877, they say, okay, we will let Rutherford B. Hayes be president if the Republicans will remove troops from the South. So the Democrats are giving the election away, which they probably should have won, in return for an end to Reconstruction. So take the troops out of the South and we'll let you have the presidency. The Republicans agree to that. By doing that, they are abandoning the freedmen who they had promised to help and support in the South. This is why it's going to take another 100 years and the civil rights movement for things to change in the South. Because with this compromise, white Redeemer Democrats is what they call themselves, return to power in Southern legislatures and are able to exercise unlimited control because they're not being checked by the federal government anymore at this point. So that's where we're going to stop. That's the end technically of time period 5, and then we'll pick up with chapter 16, which gets more into the Gilded Age, industry, labor unions, railroads, more scandal and corruption, and that is coming up next week. So hope y'all have a great day.